Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's book launch. It's a great pleasure for me to launch the book tonight. Donal and I have known each other for many years. I know most of you at this stage too, I think. Just for those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Frank Shovlin. I'm a professor of Irish literature here at the Institute of Irish Studies. Donal was my PhD student for several years, and we had many long and interesting conversations about Joyce over those years. It was a great pleasure to have Donal as part of the Institute, and he's been a great patron and friend of the Institute throughout his time as a doctoral student and in the years since. So I've lots of happy memories really of supervising Donal from the very early moments when we're just getting to know each other to meetings during COVID lockdowns, surreptitious meetings, masked, and Joyce would have enjoyed it all, I think. So the way this evening's event will work is I'm going to ask Donal to speak for about 10 minutes about Finnegans Wake and the nature of what he was trying to do. And then Donal and I will have a conversation where I'll ask him a few questions, and hopefully you'll learn. I know quite a few of you already know a lot about Finnegans Wake, but those of you who are new to it hopefully will learn quite a bit tonight. So I think I'll hand over to Donal.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Thanks for that, Frank. Well, I really enjoyed my time here at the Institute as well. Very supportive and friendly and welcoming, but also the specialist interests of the Institute were just ideal for my subject. You know, Irish literature, history, and politics. I mean, that's the Wake. It just covers those subjects in great detail. So it was an ideal place for me in every way for pursuing the subject. But as well as that, one of the things I enjoyed most being here was the public lecture series, and of course that was significantly disrupted during COVID, and I'm delighted that it's going again, that it's back in operation, and it's a real treat then to be actually part of that. It makes it even more special. So yes, as Frank said, it's customary sometimes at these launches to read a page or so from the book itself, but I feel you can't improve on Joyce. It's best to make use of the man himself, and so I thought it'd be worth looking. So do you mind putting the slide on, Frank? First at the first page of Finnegans Wake, and then if time permits, just a letter that James wrote to his son Giorgio. I'm not going to read or even cover half of what's on the first page. We could spend more than the whole hour doing that. But just to foreground and highlight some phrases and clauses and words from that first page, partly to illustrate some of the principles that I think are important when one is thinking about the Wake and maybe embarking on taking it on. And starting with the first sentence or so, which I think is quite poetic. You know, the thought about the river running from swerve of shore to through bend of bay. It's quite poetic, but there's a lot in there. The river, to begin with, is the River Liffey, and the end, it flows into Dublin Bay. Howth is a lovely headland and village on the north of Dublin Bay. It means a lot in Joyce terms. It's, for those of you who've read Ulysses, you'll recall that Leopold and Molly Bloom consummated their relationship on Howth Head, and he carries on his interests into Finnegans Wake in many ways, and we may talk about that later. But the primal couple in Finnegans Wake, Anna Livia, that's the River Liffey, and her husband Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, who appears regularly throughout the wake, typically in the guise of his initials HCE. They're scattered throughout the wake. So his first appearance is as Howth Castle. He in the wake, he's actually lying across Dublin, and Howth Head, that second picture there, is his head, and he's lying recumbent, and he's lying westward towards the Phoenix Park, which we'll talk about in a minute. I wouldn't ordinarily put so many images on a slide, but it's just to emphasise the sheer wealth of, what and richness and depth of what he includes throughout the wake. Then the second one there is a reference to the Peninsula War, which that's one of the first puns in the wake, and it refers at the first level to the Peninsular War, which Wellington engaged with Napoleon's forces. And I mention it for a couple of reasons. First is the rather ironic fact that Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was born in Dublin. That iconic symbol of British power and imperialism was a Dublin-born Protestant. And several other Irish Protestants appear on this first page. I also mention it because one of the themes and motifs that runs through the wake is that Joyce conflates military conquest and sexual conquest. So that probably is clear enough from his debasing the Peninsular War into that pun. Then the next one, Lawrence County, in Lawrence County Gorgios. The reason for highlighting that is that Dublin is one of the subjects, obviously, of all of Joyce's works. Now, there are many towns in the United States that bear the name Dublin. One of the best known is this one in Georgia. It's situated in Lawrence County, Georgia, and it's got the rather weak sort of pun as its motto, doubling all the time. Joyce might have enjoyed that because he likes playing with words, as you well know. But he's also obsessed with correspondences and coincidences, and Lawrence County also reminds some of us that Lawrence O'Toole was the Archbishop of Dublin when Henry II invaded in the 12th century. And he eventually was made patron saint. He was canonised, and he became patron saint of Dublin. And that's the sort of association and coincidence with which George was obsessed. The next one is maybe a rather complicated one. Not yet, though very soon after, had a kid-scad but ended a bland old Isaac. Now, venison there, it's another pun, and some of the puns in the wake are auditory. Now, if you read that, or if you heard it, you might hear it as very soon after. But when you see it in print, venison is clearly indicated as well. Now, much of the wake, and certainly in this first book, is situated in the Phoenix Park, which has had a herd of deer for several centuries. And that bottom picture is a picture of the park with its deer. And that monument in the background is the Wellington Monument. It is a rather phallic erection to the Duke of Wellington, but also in the wake, it remember Ericker's head, his Howth Head, and as he lies across Dublin towards the west, the Wellington Monument is represents his phallus in the wake as well. So when you think when people take Joyce seriously, sometimes they take him too seriously. He insisted this was a comic book, and comic undermining was one of his main strategies for use against the great and the powerful, like the Duke of Wellington. But also here is Isaac Butt. Butt ended a bland old Isaac. He's another Irish Protestant. He was born in Ulster in County Donegal. And while Charles Stewart Parnell has attracted and retained the most fame for driving the Home Rule movement in the 19th century, in fact, Isaac Butt was the original driver for pushing Home Rule. And although a loyalist, and he was a Federalist Unionist Protestant, he actually defended some of the Fenians, the militant nationalists. He was a barrister and he defended a number of Fenians during his career. So he's a typically complex character, and Joyce was really fascinated by complex, multifaceted characters. And going along with that, despite being a loyalist unionist, he pushed the drive for Home Rule. But he wasn't a very effective politician, and he had a rather complicated life in general. And he was actually supplanted by Charles Stewart Parnell, who was a much more astute politician and much more effective. He's another Irish Protestant, born and reared in County Wicklow. But he was nicknamed Butthead by his brothers and sisters when, as a child, in acknowledgement of his stubborn personality, which probably stood him in good stead when he was obstructing Parliament, the English Parliament, and trying to push for Home Rule. And one of the other themes in the Wake is the supplanting of the older man by the younger, and that's exactly what happened. Parnell supplanted Isaac Butt. And the other link here is Isaac as a biblical slant to this first page as well. We've already got Adam and Eve at the start, and Jacob, Isaac and his sons Jacob and Esau also appeared throughout the Wake. And so, as well as Dublin here, the first few pages of the Wake invoke the book of Genesis and the Garden of Eden as well. And I like to think that venison, there are several links, as I've mentioned already, but I like to think, with poor Isaac being butt-ended by Butthead, that raises the image of two rutting stags to me in the Phoenix Park, and lots goes on in the Phoenix Park in Finnegans Wake as well. Then there's the fall, and if we're in the Garden of Eden, well, one of the falls that's invoked is the fall of human nature, original sin, and that was a very important concept to Joyce. There are lots of other falls. Tim Finnegan of the ballad Finnegans Wake falls drunk off his ladder and is revived when somebody throws whiskey at him, the water of life. Eiriker has an unspecified indiscretion in the Phoenix Park as well, so he has a fall. Humpty Dumpty is in there as well. So Joyce goes from the sublime to the ridiculous, from biblical falls to falls in drinking songs and in nursery rhymes. And again, it makes it hard to take him seriously when you consider the wealth of sources that he invokes. And then last but not least, because it's of particular importance to my subject, is this the knockout in the park where oranges have been laid to rust upon the green since Devlin's first love Livy. Well, oranges being laid to rust upon the green, I mean, that's as clear an invocation of orange and green conflict as you could imagine, and that appears on the very first page of the text, and that's one of the observations that drove my interest in looking at Ulster and conflict between North and South, Protestant and Catholic, loyalist and nationalist. And laid to rust, there's obviously a pun in there as well, but you've got rust and decay, you've got maybe imposition of origin on green. And then with Devlin, well, the devil is there as well to complete. So the page starts with Adam and Eve and ends with the devil, but also by another association, Joseph Devlin was the nationalist leader in Belfast at the turn of the 20th century, a very prominent and important politician. And he led an organisation called the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which was essentially the nationalist equivalent of the Orange Order. So one of the other themes that run through the Wake is this correspondence of opposites. And I would think that Joyce would see the Ancient Order of Hibernians being just the same as the Orange Order, but just on opposite sides, maybe with ideology, whether religious or political, but on opposite sides. So I raise these selected points from the first page for a couple of reasons. One is some people who look at the Wake maybe without preparing in some way. Well, there's two accusations thrown at the Wake. One is that it's impossible, and then the second thing is that it's meaningless. Well, I would argue that you can access some of these themes. Yes, it might take a lot of work, and it depends on how much work you might want to put in and research. But it's not impossible. It can be accessed, and that's been one of my kind of passions really over the years, is to show that to non-specialists you can access the Wake. And the second accusation that it's meaningless, well, I would argue on the contrary that it's absolutely overloaded with meaning, and that's one of his strategies in using puns, because puns can subtend and can generate several different meanings, and there's almost no end to the potential meanings that one can derive from reading the Wake. So that's some of the first page. I've actually read a book recently that's the whole book is devoted to this first page, really. But Frank, do you want to just show the next, very briefly? This is from a letter that Joyce wrote to his son Giorgio in 1934. He was still in the throes of writing the Wake then. He wrote the Wake between 1923 and 1939, so he was still heavily involved in it at this time. He himself was an excellent tenor, and Giorgio was pursuing a career in music. So this ballad, a Ballinear ballad, he wrote actually in Italian. Giorgio and his sister were born in Trieste, and they spoke Italian at home. So this is in translation. And it just gives a bit of a flavour of Joyce's attitude to Ulster and Ulster people. So first thing is, whatever he was expert at, it wasn't Irish really, because he says he doesn't know what Ballinear means, and he says Bally means city. It actually means town. Ballinear town means the town of the yew tree. Some of you may know a suburb in Dublin called Terenure, which is the land of the yew tree. So he had, that's important in a way, he had to leave Irish behind, and he had to work in English and hone his skills and his mission in English. But I enjoyed the different terms he uses there. So by now, 1934, partition was a fait accompli. So the new state was Northern Ireland. Joyce refers to it here also as the Six Counties, which is kind of a protest term, which was still in widespread use when I was in Ireland. It was almost in the south, growing up in the south, we often referred to it as the Six Counties, and that was almost to make a point of not using the term Northern Ireland. He talks about Ulster people as being a mixed breed, and this was one of Joyce's obsessions, that that the idea of a purist race, whether Celtic or pure Ulster, is a myth. So a mixed breed is a very important concept to Joyce. And I like this description then: tough and tenacious, hard drinkers and workers, with no time for the Pope. So I think, in all his pomp and finery, I think that's a mixture on Joyce's part. There's an edge there. Maybe he's hinting at sectarianism as well as not wanting to use the term Northern Ireland exclusively. But I also feel there's grudging admiration there as well, and I hope that some of that comes through in the account that I try to give of Ulster and Joyce's treatment of Ulster and Ulster people in the book. It also shows that he was more than capable of writing very, very clear prose if he wanted to.
One of the remarkable things about the book is the patterns that Donal has noticed right throughout the book about borders, about partition. Joyce was fascinated by Irish history, and he as he began writing the Wake in 1923, obviously the border was a new development, and Joyce, although he never returned to Ireland after 1912, he always kept in touch with what was going on in Ireland, and he asked for newspapers to be sent from home and so on. And he was intrigued by what was happening in the new states as they were after partition. And Donal does a remarkable job at showing that this is a kind of a lasting obsession of Joyce's. And it's very difficult to say something new about James Joyce. He's the most written about author in the English language after Shakespeare. But Donal has managed to do that in this book, and it's a remarkable achievement. So it's been a long journey from when you must have first met Joyce to being here tonight. And I wondered if I might start, Donal, with asking you, what was your first encounter with James Joyce, and how did you become interested in him?
Yes, thanks. Well, when I was growing up and studying in Dublin, he had a very low profile. More so, he was sort of persona non grata, really. I had some awareness because I did part of my training at the Mater Hospital, which is situated at the top of Eccles Street. Now, those of you who have read Ulysses will know that Leopold and Molly Bloom lived at the bottom of Eccles Street, at number 7, which is very close to its junction with the North Circular Road. So there was some awareness walking down Eccles Street. Sadly, it was still there, but it was derelict in those days. This would have been the 70s, maybe early 80s. And while the nuns took their revenge, the matter has spread down and occupies the whole of Eccles Street now. The Mater private hospital occupies the whole street. I think the door has been saved, and it might be in the James Joyce Centre nearby. So there was some awareness. But I didn't read Joyce until I came to England, really, in the 80s. And the first book I read was, I don't know why, but I read a portrait before I read Dubliners. And I found some of it rather dry, especially the musings of Stephen, the young intellectual, trying to work out his theories of art and aesthetics. I found that quite difficult. I'm sure Joyce deliberately meant it to be difficult, but the bit that I enjoyed uproariously was the account when Stephen's still a schoolboy and he attends this retreat with the class, probably the whole class. Where the priest terrifies. It goes on for 5 or 6 pages of fire and brimstone. And of course the priest is exercising all the sins that he's assuming the boys are committing, and then he's expanding. It's like a brilliant exercise in creative writing. How much can you say about the sins that they must be guilty of, and also the punishments and the imagination that he puts into the priest describing the punishments, and some people find it quite scary. And in the book, the young Stephen is terrified into a period of abstinence and holiness as well. It doesn't last, but it did make an impression. But I found it absolutely hilarious, and again, it's the contrast between the dry sort of theorizing and just the really funny description of the retreat. So that was my first encounter, and then I went back then, read Dubliners, and then on to Ulysses.
Another interesting thing about Joyce is that he didn't publish very much. You know, for a writer who's now remembered as one of the most important writers in the English language, just three novels, a collection of short stories, one play, and some poetry. But he was, you having shown the first page there, you can see how difficult it must have been to write at that kind of complexity and that kind of depth. For those of us here tonight who are seeing Finnegans Wake for the first time, I wonder, could you tell us, why should we read Finnegans Wake? I'm thinking about a letter that H.G. Wells writes to Joyce in, I think it's 1928, where he's complaining to him about the complexity of the work that's coming out.
Yeah.
And he says to him, I've admired you for a long time. I still admire you as a man, but I'm finished with your work.
Yeah.
Why should we read Finnegans Wake?
Well, first, he wasn't the only one. I mean, lots of Joyce's supporters felt the same way. And Joyce, it may seem hard to accept this, but Joyce seemed to be genuinely taken aback at the initial reception to Finnegans Wake. He didn't. He says that he didn't want it to be unreadable or impossible. So there is that. To go on to your question, I mean, the first thing is you'd be unlikely to embark on Finnegans Wake if you haven't read the works up until then, including Ulysses. It would be possible to do, but I think it would be unlikely. So if you are embarking on Finnegans Wake, you're probably committed to Joyce and his works to some extent. And the first reason for why one would want to read Finnegans Wake is that his works, his fiction, does show a very clear continuity right through from Dubliners, a portrait, and Ulysses through to Finnegans Wake. A continuity in several ways. Firstly, I suppose there is a trajectory and the language maybe is becoming more innovative and complex as it goes along, increasingly so. But he is actually experimenting with language in the earlier works as well, and you can see, making neologisms and playing with words and puns and several meanings to expressions and words right the way through from Dubliners through to Finnegans Wake. And although the works do appear to be quite at face value increasingly complex, Dubliners itself is. There are several levels to it, apart from the apparently sparse, clear, beautifully written prose that people encounter, but also his themes. There's a continuity in themes as you go through the works as well. As you say, his interest in Irish history and politics. He was obsessed with Charles Stewart Parnell, that we mentioned already, and he appears in the Dubliners stories and in the first few pages of A Portrait of the Artist as well, and right through, and he's all the way through Finnegans Wake as well. So there's a continuity in his preoccupations and in his interest in developing language and extending the language as far as he could take it.
Given that, and given his use of other languages, of neologisms, he says at one point that he thinks of Finnegans Wake as his night book. with Ulysses as his day book. So Ulysses we've spent a day in the life of these Dubliners, Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus and Molly Bloom. And then now we're into a kind of something perhaps more like a dream world. How should we read Finnegans Wake? Give us some tips.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I put them on a crib sheet, which you can pick up. Feel free to pick up. There's a side of A4 outside that I put together on how one might approach the wake. The first thing to suggest is how not to read it, and it may be stating the obvious, but it's a very unconventional novel, so it's best not to read it as you would a conventional novel from cover to cover. So for starters, the end goes back to the beginning. So there isn't actually a beginning, a middle, and an end to it. It's circular. It's circular, if anything. So you can't just read it as a chronological narrative. And secondly, there isn't a discrete narrative. It's not just one single story. There are loads of threads of what one critic calls narrativity, which, little bits of stories, little bits of dramatic scenarios, dramatic encounters, dialogues, meetings between people. So there isn't a single narrative to it as well. And also there are not or plot, and there aren't either discrete characters. The characters merge into each other and sometimes swap over. And Erika, for example, takes the role of many different characters in the book, from Oliver Cromwell to William Gladstone to Parnell to William of Orange. There are many. There aren't discrete characters, so you can't read it. You could, but it's pretty difficult to read it as a conventional novel. You have to look at it in a different way, and I'll come on to that in a minute. The second thing I would say is, and I've put the web references for this on the crib sheet. Joyce made two recordings from his work. They're only about 5 minutes long. One of them is from Ulysses, and one is from one of his favourite chapters in Finnegans Wake, the Anna Livia chapter. And they're widely available on YouTube, and as I say, I've given web links for them as well. And if you just read them, you can just tell that he's having fun. That it's important not to take it too seriously. And I think some of the early critics in particular made the mistake of maybe over-intellectualizing and over-theorizing the Wake, when Joyce insisted that it was a comic novel. So coming to read it then, it's probably worth looking at some guidance before taking it on, and I have put on the sheet a number of fairly accessible guides. One is written by Anthony Burgess of Clockwork Orange fame. He was a great fan of Joyce's. Another by Edna O'Brien. They're on Joyce's works in general, but they do include chapters on Finnegans Wake. And then there's a couple of simple guides to the Wake itself as well. So it's probably worth reading one of those if you really wanted to take on reading the Wake itself and making sense of it. Coming to read it then, I think, and this is one of the beauties of it, you can do it at several levels. That's partly. Do you mind going back to the page, the first page? Thanks, Frank. Yeah. Again, looking at the first puns there, the P and I war. You could, without doing any research on the Wake, just go through the book to take enjoyment and pleasure out of the puns. There are puns and word plays on every single page. So that's probably the first level, the simplest level at which one could approach the Wake. Personally, I would feel that's not sufficiently satisfying, but there is still a load of pleasure to be taken from just, Venezuela as well, looking at the what's going on in there very soon, for starters. And then the next, if you wanted to take it further and look at the Wake in greater depth, you could look at two sort of areas. One is the themes of the Wake, and there are a load of themes. I mean, death, recycling, death and resurrection, and that's implicit in the fall. The notion of original sin, that was a very important concept to Joyce, because he didn't accept the traditional Catholic view that, oh yes, we've fallen in original sin. Thankfully, through the grace of God, we're saved. He was more interested in personal responsibility, actually, rather than us all being saved by sanctifying grace. There's all the notion from the Italian philosopher Vico of history repeating itself in cycles, and that's a theme that you could look at. You might want to read a few pages on Vico, which these guidebooks would offer. And the idea of language not just representing history, but actually creating history, which is a very important notion that he took from Vico as well. So they're what among the themes of the Wake. But then it also has a number of subjects which exercise these themes. So subjects from Irish history or world history. I mean, he looked on Ireland as a microcosm, Irish history as a microcosm of world history, and the Phoenix Park as standing for the universal experience via the Garden of Eden.
Just on that question, Donal, of his use of Ireland, you describe what a complex experimental piece of fiction this is, and it's not surprising then that Joyce is often seen as a high priest of modernism, and this new, very subjective style that had taken root not just in literature but in painting and music also in the early decades of the 20th century. And for a very long time, that's, I think, how Joyce was read as perhaps the most important of the modernist writers writing in English. But in more recent decades, perhaps since about the mid-1980s, I would say, with people like Seamus Dean and Emer Nolan and Andrew Gibson and others, there's been a much greater emphasis on Joyce's Irishness and his awareness of problems within Irish history. I wonder if you could say a little bit about those two approaches and where you see Joyce studies now.
Yes, I mean, to some extent, he was responsible for encouraging this image of being a high elitist modernist. If you look at the pictures, some of the famous pictures of Joyce, he always looks very forbidding, and he's rubbing shoulders with the great and the good, like Eliot and Pound and Augustus John and all these, and that's partly why I'd recommend listening to the recordings, because it's hard to take him that seriously when you hear him speaking, and also he was a great mimic as well. But also some of his pronouncements, and you have to take some of them with the grain of salt. So he said to his brother Stanislaus, who he leaned on very heavily in his early career, he said early on, "I'm not interested in politics. The only thing that interests me is style." And that could be any poser, from Oscar Wilde, throwing off a casual witticism, and I'm sure you could sit down and tease out what he means by style, and I'm sure what he means is accuracy and precision in language, which he was truly interested. But people took this literally. I'm not interested in language, in politics. And he also said, to be a successful artist, you have to detach yourself from the masses and the multitude. And I'm sure we could talk for a long time about what he meant by that, but it was taken and interpreted as him being an elitist. But as you said earlier, he wasn't. He was fascinated with Irish affairs and politics, and in fact, the very first thing he wrote as a schoolboy was sadly it hasn't survived, but it was an attack on Timothy Healy, who was a prominent politician in the late 19th century in Ireland. He was initially a supporter of Charles Stewart Parnell, but he was involved when Parnell was involved in divorce proceedings. Healy was one of the group of establishment Irish parliamentarians who brought Parnell down, and Joyce hated Healy for that. He thought he held that he embodied the notion of betrayal, the Irish betraying their own, and Healy was that was his first publication, was to attack Healy.
Tell the audience, what age was he then?
I think he was only about 12 or 14, actually.
Yeah. So he writes this poem, Et tu, Healy.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's one of the really remarkable things about Joyce when you read him and you study him, is his intelligence from being a very young boy really is astonishing. It's very hard to understand how he, so he writes The Day of the Rabblement, an essay which attacks the Irish literary theatre when he's 19. He writes the first 3 stories of Dubliners when he's 22. It doesn't seem possible.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that I admire about Joyce, is that he continues to change radically.
Yeah.
There are preoccupations, and you write very well about those, that run right from the start, whether it be Parnell or whether it be borders, that you can see right from the start, the Catholic Church, the British Empire. But for him to start so young is it's kind of humbling.
Yes, and there's no point in trying to imitate either, really, which is partly why I didn't read any of my book at the start. But even he maintained that engagement with politics all along. So when he went to Trieste, he wrote a number of public lectures, and they were published in an Italian periodical as well, on Irish current affairs, including Parnell and the poet James Clarence Mangan and the Home Rule. He was fascinated and fully engaged with Irish politics all along, really. So it was partly his fault, or at least partly down to him, when he cultivated this sort of forbidding image, and I'm not interested in politics, I'm only interested in style. I think probably playing to the gallery to some extent as well.
I'm going to ask you one more question, Donal, before I take some questions from the audience. And that's a question that's kind of fascinates me. He had written Ulysses. It had taken him about 9 years to write Ulysses. He spent a lot of the First World War in Zurich writing Ulysses, and then finishes it in Paris. And it's seen now as one of the great novels of the 20th century, and one of the most influential novels. And it's published on his 40th birthday. He would have been entitled to retire then. He'd achieved a lot.
Yeah.
But fairly quickly, he takes a few months off.
Yeah.
Fairly quickly, he starts to write this extraordinarily complex book, Finnegans Wake.
Yeah.
Why did he do that?
Yeah. Well, I think partly, as I mentioned earlier, there is a continuity in his writing, and I think he felt that he had almost a spiritual vocation to develop his project, and part of that was to develop the language as far as he could take it. Initially, the English language. You could argue that some of what he presents in Finnegans Wake is almost his own language to an extent, and people talk about translating the Wake as well. But I think he felt this great vocation, and to develop the innovation and to take the explosion of meanings and multiple meanings as far as he could. And he was also incredibly brave. He wasn't he wasn't. He was a very slight man, and he continued. Yes, he started writing the Wake in 1923, and he finished in 1938, just before war broke out. So he was writing actively through the 30s, and in his personal life, he experienced huge challenges. He was becoming progressively blind, and he had a number of eye operations. Both the disease and the treatment must have caused him excruciating pain. But to read and write through all that showed incredible courage and bravery. And also his daughter Lucia was experiencing increasingly severe mental illness, and he was very distressed by that, understandably, and he devoted a lot of time during the 30s and effort to seeking a remedy. He saw Jung and various other psychologists and psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, in an attempt to alleviate her distress. And he must have had phenomenal courage, to continue the writing project through those personal challenges. And part of the reason why he moved back to Zurich, in the late 1930s, was fear that she might have been taken by the Nazis, and with her mental illness, might have, experienced the worst end. So, he's a very brave man, and he showed incredible courage, but also he enjoyed it. His partner and his eventual wife Nora talked of. He did a lot of his writing at night. I suppose he had a little office in one of his many residences that he moved around, and she told one of her friends how she had to shut him up at night as he was writing in his little office. He was laughing so much as he was writing that she had to go and get him to shut up. He enjoyed it, and again, just to emphasise that he saw this as a comedy, maybe a divine comedy, like one of his heroes, Dante, in a way. But he saw his project as partly comic, but again that's complicated because Joyce saw comedy as having very serious purposes as well, not just slapstick. Although he enjoyed music hall, he enjoyed low culture as well as high culture, but he used comedy like with using the Wellington Monument in the Phoenix Park, like mocking Cromwell and William of Orange and Gladstone among many others. He used comedy and comic undermining as one of the tools that the powerless have to undermine the great and the powerful. So comedy was one of his missions, but it had very serious purposes.
As your book shows so brilliantly. We'll take a few questions from the audience before we retire for a drink. So if anyone, I think we're getting a mic sorted out, a roving mic. Michaela, a question over here. Yeah. Does it work? If not, Michaela, just stand up and shout. Why not?
First of all, thank you so much, Donal. This is incredible. You've actually managed to do something that no one else has ever done before, which is to put a human face in Joyce, insofar as I'm concerned. He has been deemed to be really inaccessible to us non-Joycean specialists for so long, and so I'm very much looking forward to reading your wonderful book, no doubt, to learn a bit more about that. So thank you, first of all, and congratulations.
Thanks, Michaela. Thank you.
So there are a few things, of course, which are interlinked that I'd like to bring up. So the first thing is that does Joyce have any kind of relationship to or speak about ever Jonathan Swift? The comic intention of the book, And I don't know if anyone else has recently watched the Sky Arts documentary about Swift with Frank Skinner and his sister.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Oh, very good.
We'll take that question first, Michaela. So Swift, Joyce and Swift.
Yeah, so
Very much so, Michaela. He's there on the first page. He's there on the first page. You could spend, as I said, all the time in the world on that first page, but Swift had a rather odd relationship with these two younger women, Stella and Vanessa. And Vanessa is in Venice soon after as well.
Right.
And they were there. He called them Stella and Vanessa, but they were also, their names were Esther, and Esther is in there as well, in the sisters. But Swift is all over the Wake. There are references to Gulliver's Travels, to A Tale of a Tub, to the Draper's Letters.
Yeah, I was thinking most about A Modest Proposal, and that, at the same time, contemporaneously to Swift's publication, it was deemed, to be kind of terrible, concentrated bile. But, the lack of seriousness about an organised system of cannibalism is somewhat paralleled by the very serious intention behind the undermining of the Plantagenet elites in the country at the time. So
Yes, you probably know much more about that than I do.
Honestly, it was a documentary, but there you go. But the other thing I was really interested in is about Joyce's linguistic playfulness, and about whether or not you could touch a bit more on his methodology. Frank has written extensively about his scrupulous meanness, but I'm interested in the sophistication of the structure, and about whether or not there were any kinds of indications that Joyce either believed it was possible or potentially impossible to ever have a context-free word. And the idea that all these words all have a relationship to one another beside each other or whenever they're flanked. But is there ever a point in time where he can push the boundary further in that front?
Yeah, I don't know, but certainly, and this was one of the issues with some of the early, the criticism in the 60s and 70s, the structuralists, and they very much played this idea of an ahistoric Joyce, and where context, everything's in the text, and the context is irrelevant, and I think probably that was. I don't understand all of their stuff for starters, but I think it wasn't particularly helpful, because I think sometimes, strong theory can exclude other possibilities as well. I mean, how could you argue that history is irrelevant when on the first page you have orange being laid to rest upon the green? Really, you just can't. And I think it probably was, that early context-free theory probably was responsible for that early mistaken impression, as Frank suggested, about an ahistoric and apolitical Joyce. I mean, there's so much context. His own autobiography comes through all his works, and his own experiences, as well as the Ireland of his time and the world of his time. I mean, the Wake talks about the massacre of the Armenians, by the Turks, around the end of the First World War. That's scattered through the Wake as well. It's not just Ireland. I mean, he was fascinated with the world around him, really. So I believe that context was very important to him.
One of the best books about the Wake is the very first book about the Wake, which was edited by Samuel Beckett, which had the bizarre title of An Examination Round His Factification for Incamination of Work in Progress. But Beckett essentially worked as a kind of secretary for Joyce for a period in the late 20s and early 30s. And then after Joyce's death, and Beckett becomes a famous writer in his own right, Beckett says somewhere that Joyce tried to put everything in, and I'm going to try to take everything out. That they're two kind of different experiments with language. And eventually Beckett, of course, decides to write only in French to avoid the kinds of associations you're talking about, Michaela. how can one write? Joyce is perfectly happy to write with associations. I mean, hence the punning and so on.
Yeah.
And Becca tries to do something different.
Yeah.
Niall.
Sorry, can I interrupt?
Yes, sorry.
Sorry, but just on that, there's a story about Beckett, doing dictating for Joyce. He was doing that one day, the two of them together, and a knock came on the door, and Joyce said, "Come in." And Beckett thought he was dictating, put "come in" what he was writing. And he only realised that when they were going back over it afterwards, and he pointed out his mistake to Joyce, who said, "No, leave it in."
Niall.
Thanks, Donal. That was great. Just a quick question there, because you talked about the way in which it's reflected the criticism that Joyce has been kind of forgotten. It seems so strange. Sorry, part of the universalism of his work was what was initially latched on upon. He's an everyman.
Yeah.
This reflects everything. It's classical illusion. It's not about Ireland, and it seems remarkable to me that like it takes so long. Like we're just having a book about what's obviously partition on Finnegans Wake now, right? So that's a very unusual thing. But you've kind of hinted at it, a lot of undermining and stuff. But can you just state explicitly what you think Joyce's politics actually was? What did Joyce believe in? What was he voting for? What did he think?
Yeah,
Who was he politically?
Yeah, I would say he was a moderate nationalist. He had a hatred and a horror for violence, physical violence, and he tears violent ideology apart in Finnegans Wake. I mean, part of the reason that I call him a nationalist is that the other thing that he deprecated is borders and separating people, whether by politics or by race or by religion. And remember in Ulysses, when Leopold Bloom was asked what's a nation, in the pub scene with the extreme nationalist, the citizen. And Bloom says, well, a nation is people living together, really. I think so. He would certainly have regretted partition as much for the separation and for automatically creating outsiders, us and them, really. And he certainly wasn't in favour of militant nationalism. So probably the simplest description would be as a moderate nationalist.
I think that okay. I'm going to take one more question right here, please.
Would you like a short question?
A short one.
Can you say something, in addition to saying thank you and to the Institute for organising this event, about the title, Sanguine, Boundary, Limit, in 30 seconds?
Yes. It's a quote from Finnegans Wake. I can't remember who says. You can't always tell who says what in Finnegans Wake, but it's partly a play on the expression. Well, that's about the limit, but it comes out. It's expanded to sanguine, boundary, limit, and it's partly to show his virtuosity with language. I mean, these days, the term sanguinary would be, sanguine would be generally taken to mean, well, I feel sanguine about something, so I'm reasonably relaxed and comfortable with it. But possibly an older use, especially in the adjective sanguinary, was as bloody. So it's just a lovely, I think it's a lovely example of how a very similar word can have almost opposite meanings. And of course it invokes the boundary, the border as well.
Can I come back?
You can.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I wasn't familiar with the quote, but I'm thinking of people like, say, for example, Derek Mahon, Belfast poet, Seamus Heaney.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking in terms of liminal and literal.
Yes.
Literal as in coastal, as opposed to the other.
Yeah.
And that's what struck me about that subtext. And having listened to the other discussions. I thought, really want to hear a bit more about that. So, like my friend behind, I've got to go to the library and get the book. Thank you.
I am conscious that we've gone past 7 o'clock, and we do have a glass of wine to look forward to. And I know that there are some extreme culture vultures in the audience who are heading off to the Philharmonic Hall now. So Finnegans Wake, followed by Bruckner, is some night of culture. So I just like to finish by saying that Donal is far too modest when he says that he didn't want to read from the book. The book, to use a phrase that Michaela used a moment ago there, Joyce said to his editor about Dubliners that he wanted to write Dubliners in a style of scrupulous meanness. And I could talk all night about that, but I won't. This is a book, a scrupulously written book. It is highly readable. It's revealing of very interesting preoccupations of Joyce. It is amazing, as Niall said, that it's taken us till 2024 to have a book that looks at Joyce's interest in the Irish question in Finnegans Wake, and it's a remarkable book, and Donal has done something really wonderful here. I'll close with I see some of my own former students here. They'll know this quote from Joyce. Joyce famously said, and I'll leave you with this thought, that he only asked one thing of a reader of Finnegans Wake. He said that they ought to spend at least as long reading it as he spent writing it. So thank you, Donal.